This is my world building sketchbook, and we're jumping into session 4 today. So I'm going to quickly find my place. Yes, we are going to be here. On this page, you can see I've got a map that I'm working on. I'm not totally done. I thought about today working on finishing this map and talking about some of the locations in here, but a lot of this work involves me moving the canvas so that it's at a good angle for me to utilize. And just it's a lot of this and whatnot, so I don't think I'm going to do that. It's also precision work, and I don't have everything solved in here. So it's going to require a little bit more thought. I can't do everything for this live unless you're comfortable with large chunks of time with me not talking. What I am going to be working on today is the lower portion of this and really unpacking some of the trade district that is shown in this map over here. So I was actually sitting down and starting to work on some of the sketching for it a few minutes ago as prep for this, and decided, you know what, there's a lot of decisions I'm making right now that I could talk about as I'm doing this. And I think that these kinds of things are important to work through because they force you to understand and think about a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily think about when you're world building. Whether you're writing or you're building a D&D campaign, or maybe you just like designing and drawing things. So I knew obviously that this city is going to have a lot of different sections. You know, we've got the trade district I'm going to be working on today. So that's obviously where a lot of the blue collar work is happening, which basically is the crux of a city. You know, this city is really advanced. It's old right now, so it has a smaller trade district. But in its earlier years, this trade district would have gone all the way through the orchards here into the lower market, because in the beginning of a city, it's going to have a larger need for those things. Once everything is built and stocked, you know, you could conceivably have a smaller blue collar region. We've got on the upper kind of mesa here, you've got things like the library, the council hall, the sanatorium, which is an old school term for hospital. We've got lots of towers, which is what this symbol means. The Arcanum, which is going to be a place for studying magic. But I'm probably just kind of akin to my roots. I'm honing in on the trade district first because that's really the heart of the people. Maybe you have all these sophisticated things happening in a city like Coraline, but it's, the blue collar people are what give it its heart and soul. So in beginning to think about those things, I'm trying to draw this stuff out. I started with a fountain. This is a place that has a lot of water. And so I've started with a fountain here at the bottom. And something that I run into a lot when I'm trying to design buildings or any world building setting stuff is I have a tendency to make things pure. It's really, really normal, I think. And what I mean by this is you just draw the structure and it's devoid of any context. That's actually why I did this one early on. This is in the same region. You can see there's plants climbing over things. The edges are obscured. This willow's hanging down. Because that's how a city that's been around for a long time would be. That's what it would look like. In fact, even if you've got a city that hasn't been around that long, if you have any plants that are growing, if you have any debris that's accumulating, then not all the edges are going to be perfect. So I started with that, started with some planters, and then I immediately went into drawing kind of a forge here. Next to it is a place that is producing shovels and pulled implements, so we've got things hanging here. On this other side, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet, but I'm going to come over here. I've got the path kind of going back. I want to have some of that path visible, so I think the next building I'll do is here. If you can see this line, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here in a second because I know this is pretty hard to see, but I wanted to be zoomed out for the beginning. Right down here, you can, this line is my horizon line. So I'm thinking loosely about perspective. So everything above this, we're not going to be able to see. We can see into the fountain, we can see into the planters, but above this, we won't be able to see that. And just to make the symmetry not, boring, I'll probably have this structure or the one next to it will be a little bit larger. Let's go ahead and zoom in on things. All right, we're zoomed in. So let's start with this building here. And as I'm beginning, I'm aware of a couple things. One, I don't want it to look exactly like these other structures I've got. Two, I don't really know what is going to be in this. And I will kind of, as I'm going about building the structure, think about what I might want to have in there. I'm loosely sketching things. I'm not particularly worried about whether the perspective is perfect and what's going to be housed here. Those kind of things are important, and I will work on them. But kind of at the beginning stages, it's hampering for me, at least, if I try to make sure I'm thinking through every single component. So this is going to be kind of a silo here. I'm not sure why. Maybe this is, you know, I hadn't thought about this, but maybe part of the trade district is they actually have like chickens and stuff. Maybe part of what's happening down here. I don't know if I've got areas. I've got the lower market, but obviously the market has to be fed with things. So maybe over here in the trade district, some part of something that's happening has, you know, has some refuse for the chickens to eat. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe it's kind of a part of the culture. Maybe these are animals that are raised for pets, and that fits into the trade district. I'm not sure, but that's part of the fun of world building, is you're often not going to have all your answers right at the beginning if you ever have all of them. I'm going to have another tree back here. I think maybe I'll do, oh man, I kind of want to have another one somewhere, but it's just going to mess things up. So we'll do one back here that's kind of more willowy. And that's probably fine. Up top on this page, eventually, I think I'm going to have native animals and such. So let's find a pen. Let's start putting in some details. I'm going to go loose here as I make things, because I don't want to be overly married to the details that I'm putting in. And I'm going to be working with color too, so I've got the ability to come in and do other things later. I kind of like to start with some broader strokes because I'm not doing perfect sketching throughout the whole thing, and this gives me the ability to fix things if I make a ill-mannered decision on some part of the project. This building, I'm not 100% sure what the construction is. I've got beams at the side. I kind of envision the rest of it being almost something like concrete. Maybe we've got some wear there because there's a lot of heat from this forge. Kind of envision this as a dome built into the back of that structure. And then there's a little chimney, as you definitely want to have when you're working on things like that. I'm going to come up here to the tree and just give some very basic outlines to where the foliage might be. I'm going to have this come in. Nah, well, it'll be fine. I'll be fine doing this. And then we're going to have a little other bit of foliage that comes out this way. Branch is going to kind of go back in. Trunk's going to kind of come down here. Maybe even kind of obscure the path for us a little bit. I might do another building right there as I go. Again, I don't have everything thought out here. That would be quite boring. And part of what's exciting about this kind of drawing for me is that as I'm going, I'm doing some of the discovering and figuring things out. These pens smear a little bit more than some of my others, so I have to be a little bit more conscious as I'm making my marks, but that's okay. It's also a little bit larger of a pen than some of the other ones that I like working with. I find that having a difference in those kind of things is good, though. I will instinctively make my marks different if I know that the surface is a little bit different, that the width is going to be different. Plus, there's just some extra variance that makes things a little bit more interesting. Let's actually have some of the foliage for this thing come over the top. I have no idea how that'll work, but when we get to it later, we'll figure it out. The nice part is, too, like I have things like this, which is a white acrylic marker. So if I make any really boneheaded decisions, I've got an out. I've got ways to get around that. I know it's early, but I am actually going to just go ahead and switch to one of my microns The stuff that I'm doing here has some pretty small lines to it, and I would like to get those nailed in. I'm trying to find one that's got a decent tip because I want to have a better implement. I've got so many of these guys. Ah, that one's newish. We'll use this guy. If you haven't spent any time with these, they're not expensive, and they're my just general all-purpose go-to for working on ink drawing. I love them. They're great. I've been using them for a long time. I used to get some when I was in the classroom for my students. I generally couldn't afford to get a pack of them for all my kids, but I would just keep some on hand. And then usually for like my drawing 3 and 4 students or my AP students, I would actually have the ability to purchase them their own sets. They're quite nice. I have a bunch of them. I actually buy these 01s, which are their 0.25 millimeters. I will just buy a pack of like 10 of these, and I go through them over time. It's probably really hard to see on the camera, but the tip right now on this is pretty fine. Comes out probably a couple millimeters, maybe 2 or probably about 1 or 2 millimeters. As you use it, you will inevitably push it back in, and it will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the big thing with this kind of drawing that I often mess up is thinking about what's in the foreground. So while I want to draw and sketch in the things I was working on there, really the most prudent idea is to work from the bottom up, because I don't want to disallow myself the ability to make things that are down and in front. And that gives a lot more depth to these kinds of things. So right now I'm putting this barrel in that's got all these extra stakes in it because that's in front of the structure behind. Pretty quickly I'll come down and I'll work on this stuff. And again, like I mentioned earlier, not everything needs to be done right at the beginning, and mistakes are going to happen. As I'm thinking about this particular location, though, right now, it's rather interesting because I am nearing the end of the book that this location is introduced in. And so I have a character that is from here, from Tulia, who is currently in a battle for his life. And it's been a long time. It's been, for me as a writer, I think close to 4 months, 6 months since my characters left this place. And yet, here I am still working on it. And I did that, probably not entirely on purpose. I don't know, what method is better. If you're a writer and you wanted to world build as a help to that, I could see a really logical case being made that you do the world building sketchbook first. But if you write anything like me, you uncover things as you write, as you build. And so I am sure that I would have done this and then gotten to particular locations and been like, well, I need this extra building, or I need this extra character, or this, and those kind of things are just going to happen. I keep adding characters all the time because I feel like anytime you have an opportunity to meet a new group of people, if you have 1 or 2 people that kind of symbolize what that group is like, it seems to help. And so I have a ton of characters, probably too many, but that's always stuff that can come out later on in editing if I need to. But I like the idea of having visual aids for these things, because when you're writing or, world building in any way, you kind of have a visual for things, but I find that the visual is often quite limited. And so for me to start putting things into actual physical reality, it just brings things to life in a whole new way. So I like having these kind of things. And I found too that a lot of my drawings are kind of messy, because this is a world probably most similar to something like Lord of the Rings, where the greatest age of man is over. And yeah, they're just there's a lot of old things. Magic exists, but it is mostly just a thing that people aren't putting time into anymore. It's explained pretty early on in the first book that magic is something that is a trainable skill, like art, like music. and that people are capable of figuring out, but that a lot of the young people are not doing so anymore because it requires a lot of time and a lot of energy, that there are other things that they're investing their time into, that industry and machinery have made it easy for people to forsake those things, to put their time into other stuff. And, we see a little bit of that in our world, and depending on where you're from, obviously, but there is a little bit of that. I really enjoy things like canning and jarring and pickling and stuff, and those kinds of things are more niche now. If you go to a nice gastropub where they charge you, $15, $20 for an appetizer, you're probably going to be able to get some nice, pickled, something. But back in the day, that was just a preservation technique. That was something people did just because you had to live. This was going to be a shovel, but I think it's a broom now. So I like those kinds of things. And I've just almost finished my third read of The Lord of the Rings. And it's just staggering how much there is in that novel of that kind of idea. Like, the world is, decayed. That there was a great era, an era of Atlantean people, and now that's not here anymore. Things have changed, and there's a sorrow to that. Tolkien actually talked about that kind of sorrow a bit in some of his writings. I don't think it was really in the novels so much as it was in like essays and lectures and stuff like that. But there's a sadness for the world lost, and I feel that. I feel that nostalgia. I'm not a person who feels a lot of real strong emotions on my daily basis, but I have very strong nostalgia. I'm one of those weirdos who won't, I don't cry under normal circumstances, but I can't keep myself from crying when I watch movies. There's something about the empathizing with a character in that format, in that medium, that is hard for me to resist. So immediately as I start making these kind of marks, I have to think about light source. So arbitrarily, I've decided it's coming from this direction. And so we're going to have the shadows on this side of things. Now, because I'm going to color this later, it doesn't really matter if my shadows are perfect, because I could obviously just make things darker. And again, fortunately, because I'm working with ink, I can go back over stuff later. So I can do all of my kind of initial pass, and then I can do a color pass, and then I can come back over and reform part of that color pass too. So I've got a lot of freedom with the way that this kind of drawing comes together, which is lovely. I find too that as I get older, I try to structure my art in ways that is less stressful if I can. And obviously I do some art professionally. I do some educational art here on the channel, which is kind of what this is, but not really. This is mostly just a window into what, my for pleasure work looks like most of the time. But yeah, I have to do those things in the way that I've structured my life. And so my personal art, I often try to make as less stressful as I can. Oh yeah, I'm going to have a little structure here kind of coming over to the side. It got obscured a little bit in the sketch, but I think we can still do this. So this is below the horizon line, so we're just barely going to see the top of this thing. And basically it's just going to be for holding wood, assuming that they're using wood, at least in part, for the forge. I've got, do some grass there, kind of obscure that edge. These are going to be logs. I find that thinking about these kinds of small details enable you to really start sifting through what your people deal with in your story. If you're building any kind of world, and maybe specifically if you're doing something like a D&D campaign, if you're a dungeon master of some kind, thinking about the sense, the feel of particular locations is a really powerful thing. I know we know this intrinsically, but I try when I'm writing to think about, like, what do my characters smell? Like, what is the temperature? Like, what does the air feel like? Is it clammy? Is it hot enough that they're getting sweaty and they're feeling the discomfort because of that? Those kinds of things give you an ability as a human to empathize and to understand what the people are dealing with. And I find those kinds of things really helpful and beneficial. And like I said, I try to include a lot of that kind of stuff in my writing. And so it naturally comes out in my world building too, thinking about the practicalities of how people live here. And I know some people will think that that is wasted time, that it's a waste to think about, if my characters are only going to be in this location for, 2 days, maybe a couple pages, maybe not even a couple pages in my book, then is it really worth dealing with what the people there eat? And I would say yes. I would say yes, it is. Those things can be really small throwaway comments, and that's fine. But all of those things give context. This is a coastal region, and they've existed for a long time. It's pretty mild climate-wise, not terribly dissimilar to England or New England. They get snow, but it's not crazy common, or it's not super cold. But thinking about those things allows me to figure out, well, what kind of foods do they eat? And there's going to be somebody who's reading that at some point or looking at it and going like, oh, I identify with that. That also is a meal that I find comforting in the cold of winter. And those things are funny and silly, but also just that's human life. Like, we are kind of goofy and silly, and our lives are made up of 10,000 of these tiny little situations. And so I try to include those things in my writing, because that's it feels like a powerful tool to not utilize. These kind of shapes are difficult to make when I'm recording, because it would be way easier to rotate my wrist, which I think actually I'm just going to go ahead and do. This will make it a little harder for you all to see. Sorry about that. But it will make the lines much easier for me to make. I'll take some notches out of this later, which is why I'm making the lines not perfect, because this is an old thing. Which makes me wonder, of course, like, if I was to do a city that had just been rebuilt, how would that be different? And I think the first thing is you wouldn't have any big trees, and things wouldn't, presumably wouldn't be falling apart. So I include lots of little notches out of the stonework, because if this thing has been sitting here for a long time, then storms and winter and frost are going to have taken their toll. And I think that is one of the things that's going to make your world building feel correct. If your characters in a D&D campaign are walking into a tavern and you just describe what it looks like, that's fine. But if you take some time to talk about the sign and how, 2 of the letters are worn off and it almost maybe makes a pun now or a joke. If you talk about how the local fountain has a leak, those kinds of pieces of information tell your characters, tell your people something about the world in which they're existing. And that's important. It gives flavor to something. If the fountain in the center of town is leaking, your players are probably going to be thinking about that and going, well, like, maybe this place is kind of run down. Maybe they haven't taken as good a care of their stuff as they should have. And maybe that tells you something. And again, you can plan as much as you want in those situations. Your characters are always going to find ways to mess with things. And that goes whether you're, working with a game or if you are writing. I find very frequently that my characters don't do exactly what I thought they would do. They often end up going in places that I was not anticipating. And when I have the freedom, and when I give them the freedom to be the things that I've constructed them to be, then I end up in more interesting situations. I end up with characters that I assumed were going to do one thing, and they do a different thing because, of course, they did. That's the character that I built. And I was using them as a tool to just accomplish my plot. And then I realized, oh yeah, like now they kind of oddly have will of their own. I've heard some non-writing folk talk about how that doesn't make sense to them. It's like, well, when you let your characters be versions of other people you know in real life, or when you let them be, augmented components of you, inevitably they're going to do things that you didn't expect. And for me, that's been a lot of the joy of it, is just figuring out what a character is going to do and who they're going to be. I kind of set things out and let them, give them, marching orders and backstories and stuff like that. But inevitably, they make decisions I didn't anticipate. And so far, they've all been good, as in, like, I haven't had a character that I constructed and then they went evil. That's going to be interesting, though, because at some point I'm going to have to. But I've had a lot of characters that have become more noble over time. And that's been kind of a fun thing to see, kind of an interesting thing to see. Oh, well, this is coming along nicely. This is going to be a nice little base coat for this. I do think that I'm going to have to put quite a bit more time in polishing some things off. So maybe for the next session, we'll come back. I'll have a bit more of this done. I'll be able to talk about some more of the decisions that I've made. But if there is anything specifically you want me to work on, anything you're curious about or you're working on in your world building, especially as it pertains to this sketchbook, because I think I'm actually going to start keeping more of my world building sessions adjacent to this sketchbook. And that's been a thought I've had. I've been going back and forth, like, what do I want to do with this? But I think this is just the authentic way for me to do it. This is my world building that I'm working on as far as drawing goes. As far as writing goes, I would have to start another channel for that, because that is a whole other beast. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you would like to see a writing channel, if you would like to see some particular content covered here in the future concerning my world building, and mostly just what would be of benefit to you. Like, which pieces of my logic would you like to hear me walk through about how I lay out a city, or how I design, crests and symbols, or, how I go about thinking about putting in mythical or fantastic things in a world. Because I also have beech and elm trees, but there's also the rain trees that are these, 1,000-foot tall colossal things that exist in the Sprite Forest. So whatever that might be, I would just love to hear about it. I'm not that far into these world building sessions, so I really want to get an idea of what's beneficial to all of you. Maybe you just enjoy me rambling and seeing what I'm doing, and maybe that's helpful, and maybe you want to see something specific, but please just let me know. As always, thank you for being here, and thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen now. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so in the link below. It gives you access to some things that are not here on YouTube, like I've actually gone through this sketchbook a couple times on my Patreon with exclusive videos, just showing and talking a few minutes about some of the prior sketches. It also gives you the ability to vote on things, point me in the right direction, the direction that you want to see, and it's a way for you to support me, so thank you again. If you want to check out our Discord server, I would highly encourage you to do so. That's linked below as well. That is totally free. It is just a lovely little community that will give you access to some other artists to get feedback on your work, or maybe just see what other people are up to. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon. And check back in next time. We'll keep working on this one.